A forgotten dynasty rising from the margins of the Zagros Mountains, the Kassites stand beside the Hittites and Assyrians, not in fame but in endurance. Their rule over Babylonia lasted longer than any dynasty before them, 4 centuries of stability in a region defined by collapse and renewal, yet they remain overshadowed, often dismissed as mysterious outsiders who appeared suddenly after the Hittite sack of Babylon and vanished just as quietly. The Kassite story begins in the northeastern frontier of Mesopotamia, in the high valleys and forested slopes of the Zagros Mountains. This region, stretching across what is now western Iran, was a mosaic of steep ridges, narrow passes, and fertile pockets of land fed by mountain streams. The Kassites emerged as a confederation of tribal groups, pastoralists who herded cattle and horses across seasonal pastures. Their settlements were small, dispersed, and often temporary. Their political structure was decentralized, built around clan alliances and warrior chieftains. Yet this apparent simplicity masked a deep resilience. The mountains offered protection, resources, and strategic vantage points over the lowlands. The Kassite's early development remains obscure, but they appear in Elamite texts of the late 3rd millennium BCE, suggesting early interactions with neighboring powers. Their language, poorly understood and only partially preserved, hints at a distinct cultural identity. They did not initially possess a writing system of their own. Instead, their story is preserved through Akkadian and Sumerian records, which often portray them as outsiders, sometimes allies, sometimes threats. But the mountains were not barriers, they were conduits. Through the Zagros passes flowed trade, migration, and military expeditions. The Kassites were part of this dynamic frontier, positioned between the Iranian plateau and the Mesopotamian plains. Their mobility, knowledge of terrain, and access to horses made them valuable allies and formidable adversaries. Long before they ruled Babylonia, the Kassites were woven into the regional networks of the ancient Near East. They traded livestock, timber, and mountain products for grain, textiles, and metal goods from the lowlands. Their proximity to Elam brought them into diplomatic and military interactions with one of the region's oldest states. Their mobility allowed them to serve as intermediaries between highland and lowland economies. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, Kassite groups had begun to appear in Mesopotamian texts as mercenaries, raiders, and occasional allies. They were known for their skill with horses, an asset that would later become central to their identity. Some Kassite leaders even served in Babylonian armies, gaining familiarity with the political landscape they would one day rule. The collapse of the Old Babylonian Empire created an opening. When the Hittites swept down from Anatolia and sacked Babylon around 1531 BCE, they withdrew quickly, leaving a power vacuum. Into this void stepped the Kassites, who seized control of the devastated region and began the long process of rebuilding. The Kassite rise to power was gradual, not sudden. They did not conquer Babylonia in a single campaign. Rather, they expanded their influence over decades, consolidating control through alliances, military presence, and administrative integration. By the mid-2nd millennium BCE, they had established themselves as the ruling dynasty of Babylon, known in their own inscriptions as Karduniash. Their rule brought stability to a region that had suffered from repeated invasions and internal fragmentation. Unlike the short-lived dynasties that preceded them, the Kassites governed for nearly 4 centuries, from roughly 1531 to 1155 BCE. Their longevity was unprecedented. The Kassite kings adopted Babylonian titles, participated in traditional rituals, and restored temples damaged during the Hittite raid. They embraced the cultural heritage of the land they ruled, blending their own traditions with those of Sumer and Akkad. This cultural fusion became a hallmark of their dynasty. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence between Near Eastern rulers, reveal Kassite kings as active participants in international politics. They exchanged gifts with Egyptian pharaohs, negotiated marriages, and maintained relations with the Hittites, Mitanni, and Assyria. Their diplomacy was sophisticated, their reach extensive. One Kassite king wrote to the Egyptian court, "Between us there is peace. May our friendship endure as the mountains endure." This inscription-style sentiment captures the Kassite aspiration for stability and continuity. To understand the Kassite achievement, one must examine the institutions they built and preserved. The Kassites brought their own deities into Babylonia, integrating them into the existing Mesopotamian pantheon. Among the most prominent was Shukamuna, a warrior god associated with kingship, and Shumalia, a protective goddess. These deities were worshipped alongside Babylonian gods such as Marduk, Enlil, and Ishtar. Rather than impose their religion, the Kassites blended traditions. They restored temples, endowed priesthoods, and participated in ancient rituals. Their devotion to Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, strengthened their legitimacy. They also introduced new religious symbols, including the kudurru, boundary stones inscribed with divine emblems and royal decrees. One kudurru inscription proclaims, "By the command of Shukamuna and Shumalia, let no one alter this decree." These stones served as legal documents, religious artifacts, and political statements. The Kassite state was highly organized. They adopted the administrative systems of earlier Babylonian dynasties, maintaining records in Akkadian and employing scribes trained in traditional schools. They appointed governors to oversee provinces, managed irrigation networks, and regulated land ownership through kudurrus. Their governance emphasized continuity. They did not seek to transform Babylonian society but to stabilize it. Their long reign allowed for the development of consistent policies and the restoration of economic prosperity. Kassite society was a blend of tribal and urban elements. The Kassite elite maintained their identity through clan affiliations and military traditions, while also integrating into Babylonian aristocracy. They introduced new social categories, including specialized horse breeding communities that supported their cavalry. The broader population continued traditional agricultural and artisanal practices. Under Kassite rule, Babylonia experienced a revival of rural settlement, increased agricultural production, and renewed trade. Among the most striking legacies of the Kassite dynasty is the city of Dur-Kurigalzu, founded by King Kurigalzu I near modern Baghdad. This monumental urban center served as a royal residence and administrative hub, symbolizing Kassite power and cultural ambition. Imagine approaching the city from the plain. A towering ziggurat rises above the landscape, its massive terraces ascending toward the sky. Built of mud brick and faced with glazed tiles, the ziggurat of Dur-Kurigalzu was one of the largest of its time, rivaling the great temples of Ur and Babylon. At its base stretched a complex of palaces, courtyards, and administrative buildings. The royal palace covered several hectares, with grand halls supported by wooden columns, storerooms filled with tribute goods, and residential quarters adorned with painted plaster. The city's layout reflected both Kassite innovation and Babylonian tradition. Dur-Kurigalzu was not merely a ceremonial center, it was a statement, a declaration that the Kassites were not transient rulers, but legitimate heirs to the legacy of Mesopotamian kingship. In the early centuries of their rule, the Kassites contended with rival powers such as the Mitanni and the Hittites. They navigated these threats through diplomacy and strategic alliances, maintaining control over Babylonia even as regional dynamics shifted. By the 13th century BCE, Assyria emerged as a formidable northern power. Assyrian kings launched campaigns into Kassite territory, capturing cities and demanding tribute. The Kassites resisted, sometimes successfully, sometimes suffering setbacks. One Assyrian inscription boasts, "I crossed the Tigris and subdued the land of Karduniash." Yet the Kassites recovered, reasserting control and maintaining their dynasty. The greatest threat came from the east. Elam, long a rival of Babylonia, launched devastating attacks in the late 2nd millennium BCE. Elamite armies captured cities, plundered temples, and carried off sacred statues. The Kassites fought back, rebuilding after each assault. Their resilience allowed them to endure for generations despite mounting pressures. The emotional climax of the Kassite epic arrives in the 12th century BCE, when a convergence of forces brought their long reign to an end. Assyria intensified its campaigns, seeking to dominate Babylonia. Elam launched a final, catastrophic invasion. Internal divisions weakened Kassite authority. The once stable kingdom found itself besieged on all sides. In 1155 BCE, the Elamite king Shutruk-Nahunte captured Babylon. He plundered its temples, seized its treasures, including the famous stele of Hammurabi, and carried them to Susa. The Kassite king was deposed, and the dynasty collapsed. The gods abandoned the city, the enemy entered its gates, the land was left in desolation. The fall of the Kassites marked the end of an era. Their 4th-century rule, the longest in Babylonian history, was extinguished in a storm of war and upheaval. Yet the Kassites did not disappear. They retreated to their ancestral lands in the Zagros, where they continued to exist as a distinct people for centuries. They appear in later Assyrian records as tribal groups, sometimes rebellious, sometimes allied. Their cultural influence persisted in Babylonia. The administrative systems they maintained continued under later dynasties. Their kudurrus remained important legal documents. Their integration of mountain and lowland traditions shaped the region's social fabric. Even after their political power ended, the Kassites endured as part of the complex mosaic of Near Eastern peoples. The Kassites' legacy is profound, though often overlooked. Their 4th-century rule brought unprecedented stability to Babylonia. They restored cities, revived agriculture, and maintained diplomatic relations across the Near East. Their governance allowed Babylonian culture to flourish, preserving traditions that might otherwise have been lost. The Kassites blended their own traditions with those of Sumer and Akkad, creating a hybrid culture that enriched Mesopotamian civilization. Their introduction of new deities, symbols, and administrative practices left lasting marks. Their participation in international diplomacy helped shape the late Bronze Age world. The Amarna letters reveal them as respected peers of Egypt, Hatti, and Mitanni. Later Babylonian and Assyrian texts remembered the Kassites with a mixture of respect and nostalgia. They were seen as restorers, not destroyers, a dynasty that preserved the land through turbulent centuries. In the end, the Kassites were far more than a mysterious people from the mountains. They were builders, diplomats, and stewards of one of the world's greatest civilizations. Their rise from the Zagros, their long stewardship of Babylonia, their resilience in the face of repeated crises, and their enduring cultural influence reveal a civilization that shaped the ancient Near East in profound ways.